When we think about healing from trauma, our minds usually go straight to talk therapy, right? Trying to find the words to unpack these incredibly painful memories. But what if the deepest part of a trauma is stored somewhere words can't even reach? Well, today we're diving into a really fascinating new science-backed therapy that tackles that exact idea. Let's get into it.
So, start with this question, because this is the core idea behind a pretty groundbreaking new treatment for PTSD. It basically flips the script. It says the problem isn't just a story that needs retelling, but a survival instinct that got frozen in time, deep down in the oldest part of our brain.
Okay, so to really get why this new approach could be such a game changer, we have to first understand the problem it's trying to solve. And that's the very real, very tough challenges people are facing with current PTSD treatments.
For millions of people, PTSD is this incredibly debilitating condition. And yeah, we have these gold standard therapies that do help a lot of people, but there's this huge group that they just don't work for. It leaves so many searching for another way to heal.
And the research here is, well, it's pretty stark. Studies show that up to half, 50%, of all individuals with PTSD don't get better with our current best treatments. That's literally a coin flip. For 1 out of every 2 people who are trying to get help, the standard approach just isn't bringing them the relief they need. And there's another hurdle. The average dropout rate for these really intensive trauma-focused therapies, it's over 18%. That's nearly 1 in 5 people who start the treatment but find it so difficult or so overwhelming that they just can't continue. And that tells you something, right? It tells us we urgently need new options, therapies that aren't just effective, but that people can actually tolerate. So if the current methods aren't enough for so many, what's the alternative? Well, that brings us to a fundamentally different idea. A therapy that doesn't start with your conscious thoughts or your feelings, but goes way deeper, right down to the wiring of our survival instincts. It's called Deep Brain Reorienting, or DBR for short, and its target is so specific. It's aiming for that automatic, split-second survival sequence that fires off in your brainstem. That's the most primitive part of your brain, the instant a trauma happens. We're talking about a reaction that happens before thought, before emotion, even before you're consciously aware of what's going on. Here's a pretty simple way to think about it. Imagine your brainstem has this ancient, built-in alarm system. During a traumatic event, that alarm gets tripped, and for some people, it just never fully resets. DBR is designed to go in there and help that system finally complete its cycle and stand down. So, how on earth does a therapist actually do that? How do you reset an alarm that's buried deep in the brainstem? Well, it all comes down to this very precise 4-step process that basically tracks the body's instinctual reaction to a trigger. Let's walk through it. Okay, so it all starts with O for orienting. That's when the trigger is brought to mind and it kicks off that initial physical response. Then comes T for tension. Here, the therapist helps the person notice this really subtle physical tension, often in the neck or around the eyes. This part is so important because that tension becomes an anchor, a safe physical spot to focus on. Next is S for shock. Now, this isn't emotional shock. It's a deep physical bracing in the body. By staying with that anchor of tension, this raw energy can finally be processed. And only then, after that whole deep physical sequence is slowed down and tracked, do you get to A for affect. That's when the big emotions, the fear, the grief, can finally come to the surface, but in a way that doesn't feel totally overwhelming. This all sounds pretty fascinating in theory, right? But the real question is, does it actually work? Well, for the very first time, researchers put DBR to the ultimate test, a proper, rigorous scientific study.
And listen, this is why it's such a big deal. We're not just talking about another study. This was the very first randomized controlled trial to see if DBR could make a real, measurable difference for people with PTSD. This is where a really compelling theory finally has to face the hard data.
So here's how they set it all up. Researchers got 54 people with PTSD and randomly split them into 2 groups. The first group got 8 weekly sessions of DBR online. The second group was a waitlist control, meaning they didn't get any therapy during that time. Both groups were checked for their PTSD symptoms before the trial, right after, and then again 3 months later. It's a classic, really strong study design.
Okay, so the stage is set. The trial is done. So what happened when they crunched the numbers? Well, the findings are pretty remarkable.
And the results were just crystal clear. After the treatment, the group that got DBR had way lower PTSD symptom scores. I mean, just look at that difference. An average of about 24 compared to almost 37 for the waitlist group. This wasn't some small change. It was a huge, statistically significant drop. Bottom line, the therapy worked. And when you dig into the numbers, the story gets even more compelling. Right after treatment, the DBR group saw their symptoms drop by almost 37%. But here's the really amazing part. At the 3-month follow-up, that reduction had actually grown to nearly 49%. So the positive effects weren't just temporary, they actually got stronger over time.
And what does that actually mean in real-world terms? Well, it means remission. This chart shows that 3 months after they finished treatment, more than half, 52%, of the people who got DBR no longer met the clinical criteria for PTSD. That is an absolutely life-changing outcome. Now, remember that big problem we talked about with other trauma therapies? That whole issue where nearly 1 in 5 people find it too overwhelming and drop out? So what was the dropout rate for DBR in this study? Just 4.3%. And just to put that 4.3% into context, it is incredibly low when you compare it to the 18% or even higher average for other trauma-focused treatments. This is a huge deal. It suggests that because DBR works at this deeper physical level and doesn't just flood you with emotion, it's a much more tolerable way to process trauma.
So what's the big takeaway from all of this? Well, the results from this first-of-its-kind study really seem to be pointing toward a promising new direction for treating trauma.
All right, so let's just pull this all together. The evidence from this first major study is clear. DBR significantly cuts down PTSD symptoms. Over half the participants actually went into remission, and it seems to be really well tolerated, thanks to that tiny dropout rate. It does all this by targeting the brain's raw, physical survival sequence. Now, of course, this is just the first study. The scientists are very clear that we need more research with bigger, more diverse groups to really confirm all this.
But it leaves us with this really powerful question. For centuries, we've focused so much on the mind and its stories. But this research suggests that maybe, just maybe, the key to unlocking trauma has been waiting in the body's oldest, most primal instincts all along. It's a truly profound new way to think about healing.